Joining me now to discuss food insecurity is someone who is the driving force as the CEO at the UN's World Food Program for 10 years. Catherine Bertini was credited with assisting hundreds of millions of victims of wars and natural disasters throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Professor Bertini now heads the International Relations Department at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. She's also the only U.S. member of a high-level panel of experts at the Committee on World Food Security at the UN. And Professor Bertini joins me from Syracuse University. Ma'am, thanks so much for joining us on Bottom Line. We appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Professor Bertini, what are the basic causes of food insecurity?
Poverty is the #1 cause of food security worldwide, and it is exacerbated, of course, by the inability of people in very poor communities to be able to grow their own food, to be able to have enough income to buy their own food.
Professor, do governments help or hurt the problem?
Well, governments now are sometimes getting in the way, because as we see what's happening, as a country has less and less food available, and more problems, like, for instance, the problems in the Middle East that we've seen in Tunisia and in Egypt. Many experts say one of the many underlying factors has been the high prices of food and the inability of people to be able to buy that food. So what happens often is that governments then lower the prices for food in the cities, but that puts pressure on the poor people in the countryside. 70% of the poorest people live in the countryside. Those are the ones that produce the food. They get more pressure on their own food.
Professor Bertini, I mentioned earlier in this hour that there's going to be a population explosion between now and the year 2050. Are governments prepared to deal with that massive increase in population, and how are they going to feed all of these people?
Well, governments have to put a much higher priority on supporting agriculture production and in bringing in more of the private sector in order to support agriculture production in some of the poorest countries.
Why isn't
countries
that
like
done
Africa
now?
and in the Middle East. It's been forgotten. It's not been a sexy issue. There's been a lot of emphasis on very important issues like health and education, which are critically important, but agriculture support has been forgotten since at least the 80s. Now, just in the last couple of years, there's been a rise of increase. Even the G20, the U.S. government, many others have said, gee, this is an important issue. But you know, it's an important issue not just because of 2050 and the large numbers of people who will need food, but it's an important issue now, and that even goes beyond the ability of poor people to have food right now. But when we talk about the U.S. taxpayers, the U.S. consumers, we should think not just of our own food availability, but what's happening in some of these countries where there isn't enough food availability. The estimates from the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, are that there were at least 60 riots and kind of small or large insurrections around the world that had something to do with either the lack of available food or the prices of available food. So when we try to think about bringing stability to some of these regions, from our perspective, from a security perspective from the U.S., there's an even more important reason for us to invest in helping poor farmers become less poor and more productive with food, by growing more food.
Professor, how does the production of biofuel feedstocks play into this?
Well, some experts say that biofuels put some pressure, and it does put some pressure, obviously, on the prices. It is one of the factors, but there are even larger factors. For instance, the one good news factor is that as people become less poor, and millions of people in India and China, for instance, would fit in this category, they spend more of their resources on food, and they have more expensive food, especially more foods with protein and more meat, for instance. Well, to develop a bigger cattle industry, you need a lot more grain, which puts pressure on the grain prices as well. Wheat prices have doubled just in the last about 8 months, for instance. That's one of the reasons. Another is weather. Your reporter just talked about China.
Right.
A third of the Chinese wheat crop is potentially affected by this drought. And although China grows mostly its own wheat, it's going to have to buy on the international market, which is going to raise wheat prices even higher.
Professor Bertini, how is food inflation going to change people's spending habits? And I mean in the sense there's got to be some dietary drawbacks because folks might not be able to afford the healthiest foods, but they want to purchase something obviously that's going to fill their stomachs, but in terms of health and nutrition, it might not necessarily be the best thing for them.
That's absolutely right. Whether we talk about poor people or people receiving food stamps in the United States, or people who are even poorer and earn less than $1 a day living in Africa, we're talking about the need to buy bulk, and therefore the gap is protein and the right kind of vitamin and intake that one would need for a healthy life. That's why sometimes you see a picture, for instance, in the developing world, of a very heavy woman, overweight, obese woman, and very scrawny, and her very scrawny children, because they have a lot of bulk or to eat, but not a lot of protein and not a lot of the right kind of food. And we see that in our own grocery stores as well.
All right, Professor Catherine Bertini of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, also former CEO of the UN's World Food Program. Professor, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.